The Chaco War was fought in one of the harshest environments on Earth, a vast and unforgiving wilderness in the heart of South America where heat, thirst, disease, and distance could be as deadly as an enemy soldier. Between 1932 and 1935, Bolivia and Paraguay fought a brutal war over the Chaco Boreal, a huge region of dry forests, thorny vegetation, swamps, and dusty plains that appeared almost empty on the map, but carried enormous strategic importance for both nations. At first glance, the Chaco seemed like an unlikely place to fight a major war. It had few large cities, little developed infrastructure, and enormous stretches of land where travelers could go for days without encountering a significant settlement. Roads were poor, rivers were scarce, and the climate was punishing. During the hottest months, temperatures could become unbearable. During the rainy season, roads could disappear beneath mud and water. Yet both Bolivia and Paraguay believed the Chaco mattered enormously. The roots of the conflict went back to the 19th century, when the boundaries between the newly independent nations of South America remained uncertain. Colonial maps had never clearly defined every frontier, and after independence, governments inherited conflicting claims over vast territories. Paraguay emerged from the catastrophic war of the Triple Alliance deeply weakened. The country had suffered enormous losses against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, and its political and economic strength had been severely damaged. The Chaco became one of the areas where Paraguay attempted to rebuild its territorial security and protect its future. Bolivia faced a very different problem. The country had lost its coastline to Chile during the War of the Pacific in the late 19th century. This loss left Bolivia landlocked and created a lasting national desire for access to the sea. The possibility of reaching the Atlantic through the Paraguay River system gave the Chaco a strategic importance far greater than its appearance suggested. Bolivian leaders believed that control of the Chaco might provide a route toward the Paraguay River and potentially offer the country an alternative connection to international trade. There was also another powerful factor shaping Bolivian thinking: oil. During the early 20th century, geological surveys and foreign companies increased interest in the possibility that valuable petroleum reserves might exist beneath the Chaco. Rumors and geological expectations were enough to encourage speculation, investment, and political pressure. The idea that the region might contain major oil resources made the disputed territory even more valuable. Two major foreign oil companies were particularly important to the story. Standard Oil had become heavily involved in Bolivia, while Royal Dutch Shell had interests connected to Paraguay and neighboring regions. The involvement of powerful foreign corporations later became part of the controversy surrounding the war, although historians continue to debate exactly how much influence oil interests had on the decisions of the governments themselves. The Chaco was not simply a blank wilderness, however. Indigenous communities had lived in and around the region for generations. The land had its own routes, water sources, hunting grounds, and patterns of movement that were largely invisible to outsiders. To national governments sitting far away from the region, the Chaco could look empty. To the people who knew it, it was anything but empty. This difference in perspective would become extremely important. The Paraguayan government had gradually established a network of military outposts and settlements across parts of the Chaco. These small forts were often isolated and difficult to supply, but they represented Paraguay's attempt to strengthen its claim through actual presence on the ground. Bolivia also began establishing forts and increasing military activity. Each new outpost created another point of tension. Each patrol could be interpreted as a provocation. Each new fort could become evidence in the argument that the territory already belonged to one side. The frontier slowly became militarized. During the 1920s, incidents between Paraguayan and Bolivian forces became increasingly common. Neither government wanted to surrender its territorial claims, and neither wanted to appear weak before its own population. The problem was that the Chaco itself made peaceful border administration extremely difficult. There were few reliable roads. Communication was slow. Water was precious. A military outpost might be separated from the nearest major settlement by hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain. A soldier stationed at one of these forts could be living in extreme isolation, surrounded by dense thorn forests and exposed to insects, disease, and temperatures that could make simply finding drinking water a daily struggle. The environment would later become one of the defining characteristics of the war. In Europe, armies could often depend upon railways, roads, industrial supply networks, and large population centers. In the Chaco, commanders faced a different reality. An army could have thousands of rifles and still be defeated by a lack of water. A powerful artillery unit could become useless if ammunition could not reach the battlefield. A wounded soldier might die because there was no functioning road to transport him to a hospital. A military victory at one location could become meaningless if the army could not maintain its supply line. These realities made the Chaco War unlike many other conflicts of the 20th century. There was another important difference. Both Paraguay and Bolivia had experienced officers who had studied modern warfare abroad. European military ideas had become influential throughout South America. Officers followed developments from the First World War and studied trench warfare, artillery, machine guns, logistics, and new methods of command. When the Chaco War finally erupted into full-scale conflict, both sides therefore entered the battlefield with armies that had absorbed lessons from modern warfare. But the Chaco was not Europe. The weapons might have been modern, but the battlefield was ancient and unforgiving. The soldiers would have to fight through forests that seemed to swallow entire units. They would have to navigate without reliable maps. They would have to locate hidden enemy positions while struggling against thirst and exhaustion. The first major explosion of the conflict came in 1932. A Paraguayan force attacked the Bolivian fort of Carlos Antonio Lopez near a lagoon known as Pitiantuda. The Bolivians responded by occupying the area, and Paraguay then launched a larger operation to retake it. What followed was a rapid escalation. Fortified positions that had once seemed insignificant suddenly became the center of national attention. The governments of both countries realized that the confrontation had reached a dangerous point. Neither side wanted to retreat. Neither side trusted the other. And neither side believed that surrendering the disputed territory was politically acceptable. The conflict soon expanded beyond isolated clashes. Bolivian forces began preparing larger operations, while Paraguay mobilized its army. The Paraguayan military had an important advantage that would become increasingly significant: familiarity with the Chaco. Many Paraguayan soldiers came from communities accustomed to the region's environment. Paraguay had spent years building forts and maintaining supply routes through the wilderness. Its officers understood the importance of water and local geography. Bolivia had a different challenge. The country was geographically separated from much of the Chaco by difficult terrain. Many Bolivian soldiers came from the highlands and were unfamiliar with the extreme heat and lowland environment. Moving them into the Chaco required enormous logistical effort. The difference was not immediately decisive, but it would become increasingly important as the war expanded. By the end of 1932, both nations understood that they were facing something far larger than a border dispute. Thousands of men were now involved. Fortifications were expanding. Artillery and machine guns were being moved toward the frontier. Military commanders began planning large offensives. The governments in Asunción and La Paz faced growing pressure from their populations, each demanding that national territory be defended. The possibility of a negotiated settlement was becoming harder to achieve. And deep inside the dry forests of the Chaco, soldiers on both sides were preparing for a war that neither country fully understood yet. The coming battles would test not only military leadership, but the ability of entire nations to keep thousands of men supplied in a wilderness where water could be more valuable than ammunition. The Chaco War had begun, and the struggle for this seemingly empty land was about to become one of the bloodiest conflicts ever fought in South America. As the fighting spread across the Chaco, both Bolivia and Paraguay began to realize that this would not be a short border conflict. The first clashes had already shown how quickly a small dispute could become a national crisis. But the armies now gathering in the wilderness were preparing for something much larger. Thousands of soldiers were being moved toward isolated forts. Ammunition was being transported across terrible roads, and commanders were studying maps that were often incomplete or inaccurate. The greatest enemy remained the land itself. The Chaco was a place where an army could become exhausted before it even reached the battlefield. Dense thorn forests restricted movement and visibility. Tall grasses concealed enemy positions. During the dry season, dust filled the air and water sources became dangerously scarce. During the rainy season, roads could turn into deep mud, making vehicles and supply wagons nearly useless. For soldiers arriving from Bolivia's highlands, the environment was particularly difficult. Many had grown accustomed to cooler temperatures and mountainous terrain. Suddenly, they were expected to operate in a hot lowland wilderness where unfamiliar diseases and insects were everywhere. Paraguayan troops generally had more experience with the region. Paraguay had spent years building small military forts throughout the Chaco, and its soldiers had learned the locations of wells, trails, and water sources. This knowledge would become one of the country's greatest advantages. The Bolivian army, however, had important strengths of its own. Bolivia had a larger population and access to significant financial resources. Its military leadership had studied European warfare, and some officers had experience observing or participating in conflicts influenced by the First World War. The two armies therefore approached the conflict with different advantages. Bolivia possessed greater potential resources. Paraguay possessed familiarity with the battlefield. The first major campaigns demonstrated how important this difference would become. Bolivian commanders hoped to use their superior resources and larger army to capture strategic Paraguayan positions quickly. Their objective was not simply to occupy territory. They wanted to break Paraguay's defensive network and establish control over important routes leading deeper into the Chaco. Paraguay, meanwhile, concentrated on defending its forts while preparing counterattacks against isolated Bolivian positions. The struggle soon centered around fortified outposts. These forts were often little more than defensive trenches, wooden structures, sandbags, bunkers, and artillery positions surrounded by dense vegetation. Yet their importance was enormous. A single fort might control a road, a water source, or a narrow passage through the forest. Capturing one could open a route for an entire army. Losing one could expose dozens of kilometers of territory. One of the most important early battles took place around Fort Bacquaran in September 1932. Bolivian troops had occupied the fort, and Paraguayan forces moved to surround it. What followed was a brutal siege lasting several weeks. The defenders were surrounded by Paraguayan troops and increasingly cut off from supplies. Paraguayan forces attacked repeatedly, attempting to break through the fortifications while also preventing reinforcements from reaching the Bolivian garrison. Inside Bacquaran, the situation became desperate. Food and water were limited. Medical supplies were running short. Wounded soldiers could not easily be evacuated. The defenders were under constant pressure from artillery and infantry attacks. Yet the Bolivians continued resisting. The battle became a symbol of determination for Bolivia, while Paraguay's relentless assault demonstrated the seriousness of its military response. Eventually, after weeks of fighting, the Bolivian defenders were forced to surrender. The fall of Bacquaran was an enormous psychological victory for Paraguay. It demonstrated that the Paraguayan army could defeat a larger opponent in the harsh conditions of the Chaco. It also boosted morale throughout Paraguay and gave Paraguayan commanders greater confidence for the campaigns that followed. For Bolivia, the defeat was deeply embarrassing. The government had expected its military superiority to produce rapid results. Instead, one of its important positions had fallen after a prolonged siege. The battle also revealed a fundamental truth about the war. Numbers alone would not decide the conflict. The side that understood how to move, fight, and survive in the Chaco would have a major advantage. Paraguayan commanders increasingly developed tactics based on mobility and local knowledge. Rather than constantly attacking heavily defended positions directly, they searched for ways to surround enemy units, cut supply routes, and isolate garrisons. Water became central to these strategies. A fort without water could not survive. A military column without reliable water supplies could not advance. A wounded army unable to reach a functioning water source could collapse without ever encountering the enemy. This made wells some of the most valuable military objectives in the entire war. Both armies began fighting not only for land, but for access to water. Soldiers learned to conserve every drop. Water trucks became essential. Engineers searched for underground sources and attempted to construct wells in remote locations. Entire operations were planned around the availability of drinking water. The importance of logistics grew with every campaign. A modern army needed ammunition, food, medicine, fuel, spare parts, and communications equipment. But all of these supplies had to cross enormous distances through difficult terrain. Paraguay developed a strong logistical system centered on river transportation. The Paraguay River allowed supplies to reach important areas more efficiently before being moved inland toward the fighting. Bolivia faced greater geographical obstacles. Its main population centers and industrial resources were farther from the battlefield, and transportation routes into the Chaco were difficult. Roads had to be constructed and maintained under extreme conditions. The contrast between the two supply systems became increasingly important. While soldiers fought in the forests, military planners far from the front were fighting another war involving trucks, fuel, railways, riverboats, factories, hospitals, and food production. Every battle depended upon these invisible systems. The war also became increasingly expensive. Both countries had limited economies compared with the major powers of the world. Maintaining large armies for years required borrowing money, increasing taxes, and redirecting national resources toward military production. Foreign arms suppliers became important. Bolivia purchased weapons and equipment from several European sources, including modern artillery and military aircraft. Paraguay also obtained foreign weapons and relied on international purchases to maintain its forces. The Chaco, therefore, became a battlefield where weapons developed in Europe were tested under conditions completely different from those for which many had originally been designed. Aircraft played an increasingly important role as well. Both sides used military aviation for reconnaissance, transporting supplies, and occasionally attacking enemy positions. Aircraft could observe movements across areas that were almost impossible to patrol on foot. In a landscape where visibility from the ground was often limited, aerial reconnaissance provided commanders with information that could mean the difference between an ambush and a successful advance. Yet technology could not eliminate the fundamental problems of the Chaco. A pilot could locate an enemy column, but ground troops still had to travel through the forest to reach it. A truck could carry supplies, but it needed fuel and roads. A radio could transmit orders, but the soldiers receiving them still needed water. The environment continued to dictate the pace of the war. As 1932 turned into 1933, the conflict became increasingly organized and increasingly deadly. Both governments expanded mobilization. Young men were recruited into the armed forces. Training programs accelerated. Factories and workshops worked to repair weapons and vehicles. Hospitals prepared for growing numbers of wounded and sick soldiers. The original dispute over the Chaco was becoming a national struggle that demanded sacrifices from entire populations. For Paraguay, the victory at Boquerón created enormous confidence. For Bolivia, the defeat created pressure for change. Military leaders began reconsidering their strategy, recognizing that simply pushing large formations into the Chaco would not guarantee success. The Bolivians needed a new approach. They needed commanders who understood the geography. They needed stronger logistics. They needed better coordination between infantry, artillery, aircraft, and supply units. And above all, they needed to find a way to overcome Paraguay's growing advantage in the wilderness. The The next major campaigns would become even larger, drawing tens of thousands of soldiers into battles fought around isolated forts and narrow routes through the forest. The Chaco was consuming men at an extraordinary rate, and neither Bolivia nor Paraguay was yet prepared to stop. Of military outposts and settlements across parts of the Chaco, these small forts were often isolated and difficult to supply, but they represented Paraguay's attempt to strengthen its claim through actual presence on the ground. Bolivia also began establishing forts and increasing military activity. Each new outpost created another point of tension. Each patrol could be interpreted as a provocation. Each new fort could become evidence in the argument that the territory already belonged to one side. The frontier slowly became militarized. During the 1920s, incidents between Paraguayan and Bolivian forces became increasingly common. Neither government wanted to surrender its territorial claims, and neither wanted to appear weak before its own population. The problem was that the Chaco itself made peaceful border administration extremely difficult. There were few reliable roads. Communication was slow. Water was precious. A military outpost might be separated from the nearest major settlement by hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain. A soldier stationed at one of these forts could be living in extreme isolation, surrounded by dense thorn forests and exposed to insects, disease, and temperatures that could make simply finding drinking water a daily struggle. The environment would later become one of the defining characteristics of the war. In Europe, armies could often depend upon railways, roads, industrial supply networks, and large population centers. In the Chaco, commanders faced a different reality. An army could have thousands of rifles and still be defeated by a lack of water. A powerful artillery unit could become useless if ammunition could not reach the battlefield. A wounded soldier might die because there was no functioning road to transport him to a hospital. A military victory at one location could become meaningless if the army could not maintain its supply line. These realities made the Chaco War unlike many other conflicts of the 20th century. There was another important difference. Both Paraguay and Bolivia had experienced officers who had studied modern warfare abroad. European military ideas had become influential throughout South America. Officers followed developments from the First World War and studied trench warfare, artillery, machine guns, logistics, and new methods of command. When the Chaco War finally erupted in a full-scale conflict, both sides therefore entered the battlefield with armies that had absorbed lessons from modern warfare. But the Chaco was not Europe. The weapons might have been modern, but the battlefield was ancient and unforgiving. The soldiers would have to fight through forests that seemed to swallow entire units. They would have to navigate without reliable maps. They would have to locate hidden enemy positions while struggling against thirst and exhaustion. The first major explosion of the conflict came in 1932. A Paraguayan force attacked the Bolivian fort of Carlos Antonio Lopez near a lagoon known as Pitiantuta. The Bolivians responded by occupying the area, and Paraguay then launched a larger operation to retake it. What followed was a rapid escalation. Fortified positions that had once seemed insignificant suddenly became the center of national attention. The governments of both countries realized that the confrontation had reached a dangerous point. Neither side wanted to retreat. Neither side trusted the other. And neither side believed that surrendering the disputed territory was politically acceptable. The conflict soon expanded beyond isolated clashes. Bolivian forces began preparing larger operations, while Paraguay mobilized its army. The Paraguayan military had an important advantage that would become increasingly significant: familiarity with the Chaco. Many Paraguayan soldiers came from communities accustomed to the region's environment. Paraguay had spent years building forts and maintaining supply routes through the wilderness. Its officers understood the importance of water and local geography. Bolivia had a different challenge. The country was geographically separated from much of the Chaco by difficult terrain. Many Bolivian soldiers came from the highlands and were unfamiliar with the extreme heat and lowland environment. Moving them into the Chaco required enormous logistical effort. The difference was not immediately decisive, but it would become increasingly important as the war expanded. By the end of 1932, both nations understood that they were facing something far larger than a border dispute. Thousands of men were now involved. Fortifications were expanding. Artillery and machine guns were being moved toward the frontier. Military commanders began planning large offensives. The governments in Asunción and La Paz faced growing pressure from their populations, each demanding that national territory be defended. The possibility of a negotiated settlement was becoming harder to achieve. And deep inside the dry forests of the Chaco, soldiers on both sides were preparing for a war that neither country fully understood yet. The coming battles would test not only military leadership, but the ability of entire nations to keep thousands of men supplied in a wilderness where water could be more valuable than ammunition. The Chaco War had begun, and the struggle for this seemingly empty land was about to become one of the bloodiest conflicts ever fought in South America. By 1933, the Chaco War had become a full-scale struggle in which both nations were committing enormous resources to a landscape that seemed determined to destroy anyone who entered it. The early fighting had already demonstrated the importance of fortified positions, water, transportation, and local knowledge. Now the armies were becoming larger, the operations more ambitious, and the consequences of failure more severe. For Bolivia, the defeat at Baqueran had been a painful lesson. The country had entered the war believing that its larger resources and better-equipped army could overwhelm Paraguay. Instead, the Paraguayan forces had demonstrated that determination, preparation, and familiarity with the Chaco could overcome advantages in equipment. Bolivia began reorganizing its military leadership. One of the most important figures to emerge was General Hans Kuhn, a German officer who had previously served as a military advisor in Bolivia. Kuhn had experience with European military doctrine and was regarded by many Bolivian leaders as a commander capable of restoring the army's fortunes. His appointment reflected a broader belief that European methods could provide the solution. The problem was that the Chaco presented challenges that were fundamentally different from those faced by European armies. There were no dense railway networks carrying troops toward the front. There were no large industrial cities close to the battlefield. There were no easy roads connecting major bases. Instead, there were narrow trails, thorn forests, scattered wells, and immense distances. Kuhn attempted to apply large-scale offensive operations, concentrating troops and artillery against Paraguayan defensive positions. In some circumstances, this produced temporary success, but the deeper problem remained logistics. Every additional kilometer of advance increased the distance between Bolivian troops and their supply bases. Paraguayan forces could often exploit this problem. They knew where water existed. They knew which routes were passable. They understood how quickly the heat could exhaust soldiers. And they became increasingly skilled at cutting enemy supply lines. One of the most important battles of 1933 took place around Campo Grande. Bolivian forces attempted to break through Paraguayan positions, but Paraguayan commanders responded with a series of counterattacks that eventually surrounded significant portions of the Bolivian army. The resulting defeat demonstrated how dangerous an exposed supply line could become. The battlefield was not simply determined by who possessed more soldiers. An army could be surrounded because its food and ammunition could no longer reach it. A unit could be forced to retreat because its water supply had been captured. A commander could lose an entire formation because troops became exhausted before reinforcements arrived. This was warfare in which geography could function like another army. The Paraguayan command increasingly exploited this reality. General José Félix Estigarribia became one of the most important Paraguayan commanders of the war. He was methodical, patient, and deeply aware of the importance of logistics. Rather than relying exclusively on massive frontal attacks, he often sought to maneuver around Bolivian positions and threaten their communications. This approach gradually produced major results. The Paraguayan army began recovering territory and placing increasing pressure on Bolivian forces. Meanwhile, the war was becoming a humanitarian disaster. Thousands of soldiers were dying from disease. Malaria was widespread. Dysentery weakened entire units. Other tropical diseases spread through camps. Poor sanitation made even minor infections dangerous. Water sources were often contaminated, and soldiers sometimes had no choice but to drink water. That carried disease. The medical services on both sides struggled to cope. Hospitals were often far from the front. Evacuating wounded soldiers through the Chaco could take days. Some wounded men died during transportation because vehicles could not move quickly across rough roads. Others remained in field hospitals with limited medicine and inadequate supplies. The psychological strain was enormous as well. Soldiers spent weeks or months in isolated positions surrounded by dense vegetation. They could hear gunfire without seeing the enemy. They slept poorly because of insects and extreme heat. The constant threat of ambush created a level of tension that gradually wore down even experienced troops. The environment affected morale as much as combat. A soldier could survive a battle and then die from disease days later. A unit could successfully capture an enemy position only to discover that there was no reliable water source nearby. An apparently minor logistical failure could force an entire offensive to collapse. By late 1933, Paraguay had gained increasing confidence. Bolivian forces suffered several serious defeats, and the government in La Paz began facing growing criticism. The military leadership was under pressure. The country had expected a relatively short conflict. Instead, the war had already lasted more than a year and consumed enormous amounts of money and manpower. The political consequences were becoming increasingly serious. Bolivia's government needed victories to maintain public confidence, but each failed offensive created new criticism. The military leadership eventually faced a major crisis. The defeat at Campo Villa in December 1933 became one of the most devastating moments for Bolivia. Paraguayan forces managed to encircle a large Bolivian formation. Thousands of Bolivian soldiers were captured. The scale of the defeat shocked Bolivia. It was not merely a lost battle. A significant portion of the army had been neutralized in a single operation. The consequences reached the highest levels of government. General Kunt lost his position as commander, and Bolivia was forced to reconsider its entire strategy. For Paraguay, Campo Villa was a major triumph. The victory demonstrated that the Paraguayan army had developed into a highly effective fighting force despite the country's smaller population and limited resources. Estigarrabia's strategy of maneuver, pressure, and encirclement had succeeded. But victory came at a tremendous cost. Paraguay was also losing thousands of soldiers. Its population was much smaller than Bolivia's, meaning every casualty represented a serious burden. The war could not continue indefinitely without exhausting the country's ability to replace its losses. This was becoming true for both nations. The battlefield victories were therefore creating a paradox. Each side could win territory while becoming weaker. Each successful offensive consumed men, ammunition, vehicles, and food. Each retreat left behind dead and wounded soldiers. The Chaco itself remained largely undeveloped, meaning that even captured territory was difficult to occupy and administer. The war was becoming a contest of endurance. Which country could remain organized longer? Which government could maintain public support? Which army could replace its casualties? Which side could keep its soldiers supplied with water and ammunition? And which commander could turn limited resources into decisive results? At the beginning of 1934, Paraguay appeared to have gained the upper hand. Its forces were moving deeper into territory that Bolivia had previously controlled. Bolivian commanders were reorganizing their army and attempting to restore morale. But Bolivia still possessed substantial resources. The war was far from decided. The next campaigns would bring some of the largest battles of the entire conflict. As Bolivia attempted to reverse its defeats and Paraguay attempted to turn its battlefield successes into a final strategic victory, the struggle would soon reach an even more dangerous stage, with both countries committing themselves to enormous offensives across the unforgiving Chaco. And once again, Thousands of soldiers would enter the wilderness where victory could depend on something as simple and essential as finding water before the enemy did. By 1934, the Chaco War had already consumed enormous numbers of soldiers, vast amounts of money, and years of national effort. Yet neither Bolivia nor Paraguay had achieved everything it wanted. The war had become a contest of endurance, and the longer it continued, the more difficult it became for both governments to justify the growing cost in human lives. Bolivia had suffered several major defeats, but it still possessed a larger population and considerable military resources. The country reorganized its forces and placed greater emphasis on defensive operations, artillery, aviation, and improved logistics. Bolivian commanders understood that simply repeating earlier offensives would lead to more disasters. Paraguay, meanwhile, had gained confidence after its victories, but its own situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Its army had advanced deep into the Chaco, yet every additional kilometer created new supply problems. Soldiers were operating farther from established bases, while maintaining roads and transporting water became increasingly demanding. The war had reached the point where even successful armies were exhausted. One of the major battles of this period took place at El Carmen in late 1934. Paraguayan forces attempted to maneuver against Bolivian positions, but Bolivian troops had strengthened their defenses and were becoming more experienced in dealing with Paraguayan tactics. The fighting demonstrated that Bolivia had not been defeated. Despite its earlier disasters, the Bolivian army was still capable of launching strong operations and inflicting serious losses. The Battle of Urendeg later that year became another important confrontation. Paraguayan forces managed to capture the strategic area and gain access to important water sources. Once again, the struggle demonstrated that control of water could determine the outcome of an entire campaign. Soldiers could fight for hours without food. They could march for days with little sleep. But without water, an army could not survive. The importance of wells and water routes became so extreme that commanders sometimes planned entire offensives around capturing them before the opposing army could reach them. The war also placed extraordinary demands on military transportation. Thousands of trucks moved through rough terrain carrying ammunition, food, fuel, and water. Vehicles broke down constantly. Roads became unusable after rain. Engines struggled in the heat. Spare parts were difficult to obtain. The logistical war behind the battlefield was becoming as important as the battles themselves. Bolivia had an advantage in some areas because it could draw upon greater industrial and financial resources. Paraguay had the advantage of a highly experienced army and supply routes connected to the Paraguay River. Neither advantage was enough to produce an immediate final victory. By the beginning of 1935, exhaustion was becoming impossible to ignore. Both countries had lost tens of thousands of soldiers. Disease had killed enormous numbers of men who never appeared in official battlefield statistics. Families at home were struggling with the absence of husbands and sons. Governments were spending money that could have been used for economic development. The political atmosphere was changing. The original enthusiasm that had surrounded the war was fading. People wanted their soldiers to come home. Military leaders began recognizing that continuing the conflict might produce little more than additional casualties. International governments also became increasingly concerned. Several South American countries attempted to mediate between Bolivia and Paraguay. Argentina played an especially important diplomatic role in efforts to bring the conflict toward a negotiated settlement. The pressure for peace increased as the fighting continued. By June 1935, both sides were exhausted enough to accept an armistice. On June 12th, the fighting stopped. After almost 3 years of war, the guns of the Chaco finally fell silent. But the questions that had started the conflict were not immediately solved. The two countries still had to determine the final boundaries of the disputed territory. Negotiations continued for years. Eventually, the peace settlement confirmed that Paraguay would retain most of the disputed Chaco territory, while Bolivia received access to the Paraguay River through a smaller area. The outcome was a major territorial victory for Paraguay. Bolivia, however, had suffered an enormous strategic and psychological defeat. The country had entered the war hoping to gain territory and possibly secure a route toward the Atlantic. Instead, it lost large numbers of soldiers and failed to achieve its principal territorial objectives. The consequences inside Bolivia were profound. The war exposed weaknesses in the country's political and military system. Many soldiers returned home deeply disillusioned. Indigenous and working-class Bolivians who had served in the army began questioning the social and political order that had existed before the war. The conflict contributed to major political changes in Bolivia. A generation of veterans became increasingly influential in public life. Their experiences during the war shaped new political movements and contributed to demands for reform. The Chaco War, therefore, helped transform Bolivia's internal politics almost as much as it transformed its foreign policy. Paraguay also emerged victorious, but victory did not mean prosperity. The country had suffered enormous casualties relative to its population. Its economy had been heavily strained, and thousands of families had been permanently affected by the loss of loved ones. The land Paraguay gained was enormous, but much of it remained difficult to develop. The Chaco was still the same harsh wilderness. Winning the territory did not suddenly make it fertile or easy to inhabit. The war also left a lasting legacy in the military institutions of both nations. Paraguayan commanders such as José Félix Estigarribia became national heroes. Estigarribia's careful use of maneuver, logistics, reconnaissance, and encirclement was widely studied as an example of effective command under difficult conditions. Bolivian veterans also carried their experiences into later political life. The war had taught an entire generation of soldiers lessons about leadership, logistics, national inequality, and the enormous difference between military theory and reality. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Chaco War was that modern weapons do not eliminate the fundamental realities of warfare. Artillery could destroy fortifications. Aircraft could provide reconnaissance. Machine guns could dominate open ground. Trucks could move armies across enormous distances. But none of these technologies could solve the problem of water. None could prevent disease from spreading. None could erase the exhaustion of soldiers marching through heat and thorn forests. The Chaco itself remained the ultimate battlefield. Thousands of men entered its forests believing they were fighting for national destiny. Many never returned. The war had begun with competing territorial claims, strategic ambitions, concerns about access to trade, and speculation about natural resources. It ended with exhausted nations, tens of thousands of dead, and a settlement that largely favored Paraguay. For decades afterward, the Chaco War remained one of the defining experiences of both countries. In Paraguay, it became a powerful symbol of national endurance and military achievement. In Bolivia, it became a symbol of sacrifice, loss, and the need for profound political change. And for historians, the conflict became an extraordinary example of how geography, nationalism, logistics, and human endurance can determine the course of a war. The Chaco had looked almost empty on a map, but during those 3 terrible years, it became the scene of one of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of South America. The forests eventually grew quiet again. The forts were abandoned. The soldiers returned home, but the memory of the war remained. It remained in the families who had lost loved ones, in the veterans who carried their experiences for the rest of their lives, and in the political changes that followed the conflict. The Chaco War ended in 1935, but its consequences continued long afterward. It stands as a reminder that the most devastating wars are not always fought over famous cities or wealthy territories. Sometimes they begin over distant borders that appear insignificant, and sometimes the harshest battlefield is not created by human beings at all. It is the land itself. And in the Chaco, that land tested 2 nations until both were finally too exhausted to continue.